All right, hello everyone. This is Julia Hu. You also have Alicia Jones from Myers and Stauffer. This is a re-recorded presentation of the Colorado HTP performance measure training presented to hospitals on December 15th, 2022. As for the purpose of today's training, in addition to interim activity reporting and CH&E reporting this quarter, hospitals will also be responsible for performance measure data reporting, with this reporting due in January 2023. So this reporting component will include the data from October 2021 through September 2022. And this data is also critical in establishing baselines and some benchmarks for the HTP program. So today we will be walking through that key information as well as any resources to ensure the hospital's success in the upcoming quarterly reporting. So let's review today's agenda. We'll talk about updates to key documents in the program, which have been posted to the Colorado HTP website. So that starts off by focusing on measure specifications, where we'll review every update or clarification to the measure specification since the last posted version. The scoring framework has also been updated recently, and we will review any of those updates associated with that document, as well as new chapters to the quarterly reporting guide. Afterwards, Alicia will discuss the most updated version of the self-reported measure workbook and any adjustments that have been made since last year's Program Year Zero reporting. We will walk through, we'll conduct a live walkthrough of that workbook and make sure that hospitals have the information they need to feel comfortable with the self-reported data workbook completion as well as submission. We will also discuss the new data availability policy, which is applicable for some instances for measure reporting. We will, in future slides, walk through what that looks like. After that, we will provide a high-level overview of claims measures and the logistics around that process. We will review our minimum submission review procedures, which we have further fleshed out since Program Year Zero reporting this past March 2022. And related to that, we will discuss the scoring review and reconsideration process for performance measures. Lastly, we will go over the performance measure timeline and next steps. Let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start our document updates portion with the measure specification updates. So that is the first document that has been updated and is now posted to the Colorado HTP website. So this latest version, with the link on the slides here, of the measure specifications document is updated, now available on the HTP website. This version includes updates to several performance measures, and hospitals should be reviewing these prior to their reporting. Today we'll be walking through those changes that have stemmed from multiple discussions and decisions from the past several months, and we'll cover updates to the measures displayed on the screen here. So we'll go over these one by one. Starting off with SWRH1, 30-day all-cause risk-adjusted hospital readmission measure. So first, we've had measure specification updates with this measure, the 30-day all-call risk-adjusted hospital readmission measure. This is a claims-based measure based on the HIE specifications. So in terms of changes, we've made clarifications regarding the data pool, particularly the numerator and denominator wording around Medicaid admissions. We've added language defining those Medicaid admissions, Medicaid index admissions, and actual expected readmissions. We also added some definitions and updated definitions in the exclusions. So this update to the exclusions can be seen in multiple measure specification updates, not just SWRH1. But in summary, we are excluding patients with Medicare enrollment, dual eligible patients, third-party insurance managed care, or third-party insurance, managed care, and emergency Medicaid services. We've also included discharge status codes for the exclusion denominator, and we've updated that risk adjustment. The next measure, SWRH2, the pediatric all condition readmission measure. So the biggest change is that this was a claims-based measure and now will be a hospital self-report. So hospitals that chose this measure will be reporting the pediatric health information system data in their self-reported measure books. The benchmarks were already set for this measure. So the benchmark is the mean of that national data set, which has been determined to be 6.36%. The next is looking at the top quartile, which would be 5.77%. And then we set that as a benchmark for program year 5 using the average of the mean and the top quartile set at 6.07%. So just in summary, first performance year in program year 3, the benchmark will be 6.36%. Hospitals will be responsible for a benchmark in program year 4 at 6.07%. And then the benchmark for program year 5 will be 5.77%. As for the next measure, RH2, this is regarding ED visits for which the member received follow-up within 30 days of ED visits. We've updated the exclusion criteria here as well to include Medicare, third-party insurance, patients with managed care, and patients with emergency Medicaid. So to clarify, patients that are dually eligible for Medicare and Medicaid are also excluded. Furthermore, a visit back to the emergency department within 30 days will not be counted as a follow-up visit. We've also added procedure codes and billing provider information regarding how we're defining an ambulatory visit. For CP1 adults, readmission rate for a high frequency chronic condition 30-day. This is the next measure. Again, this is for adults. We've expanded the wording in the definition of the numerator and denominator for clarity. We updated the same exclusions as we've mentioned before around claims-based measures. We've also updated discharge status codes in the exclusions. The target population has also been updated to reflect adult Medicaid patients 18 or older that are non-hospice patients and non-outlier Medicaid patients. They're excluding outliers in that measure. So the benchmark methodology has been updated. In this case, because there are more than 10 hospitals that selected this measure, benchmark will now be set to average performance. So this will be consistent with other measures with the same, will be consistent with other measures that there are greater than 10 hospitals who have chosen that measure. So we can, make consistent the methodology for that benchmark there. So previously it was a year-over-year improvement benchmark, and now it will be considered an average benchmark moving forward. Next is CP1 pediatric. So the pediatric readmissions rate chronic condition 30-day. All of the changes here will align with the changes that we made for the all-cause readmission, so the CP1 adult measure. We are aligning with the pediatric hospital information system data set here. So we will be adjusting the measure to make sure that our data sets are aligning with the benchmarking data. I think the biggest change here is that CP1 pediatric used to be a claims-based measure, but now will be a hospital self-reported measure. And we have also received the data and we're able to set the benchmarks for this measure as well, which are displayed on this slide. So for program year 3, it was set by the mean of the national data set, which is going to be 5.92%. The program year 4 benchmark, which was the midpoint between the mean and the top quartile, was 5.87%. And then the benchmark for program year 5 will be the top quartile of the national data set, which is 5.81%. And just to clarify between this measure and the previous one, there are 2 versions of the CP1 measure. So be aware of that. CP1 adult is going to be a claims-based measure, and then CP1 pediatric is now a hospital self-reported measure, when it once was also a claims-based measure. That is the change in the newest updated specifications. Oh, excuse me. Go back. All right, CP6. So CP6 is a screening referral for peripartum and postpartum depression and anxiety. And then also a notification of the positive screens to the RAE. So for this measure, we have updated wording in the additional consideration section of that measure, that we're looking for a normalized and validated depression and anxiety screening tool that was developed for the patient population in which it is being utilized. We're not looking for a tool that has been normalized and validated for the peripartum and perinatal populations. So if you have a full year's worth of data for this measure, you can provide the count. If not, you can put NDA or no data available. And we'll further explain what that means in future slides. The SWBH1 is collaboratively developing and implementing a mutually agreed upon discharge planning and notification process for the appropriate RAEs for eligible patients. In terms of changes to this measure, we've had some slight wording clarifications in the definition that were modified and updated. So the numerator and denominator will include eligible Medicaid patients that are discharged from inpatient observation and emergency department. We've also updated in this in the additional consideration section that notifications to the RAE should be diagnoses that are relevant at the time of discharge and not historical diagnosis or other social or medical history that is not deemed to be a current diagnosis by the attending clinician. For SWBH2, this is a pediatric screening for depression and inpatient ED measure, which includes suicide risk. We've updated the definition to reflect patients 12 to 17 years of age discharged to home from an inpatient stay who are screened for depression, including suicide risk. We've added patient refusal as an exclusion as well. And we've updated the target population to include patients 12 to 17 years of age again. In the additional consideration section, we've added patients admitted inpatient from the emergency department. Only one screen is required before discharge. All right, next measure, SWPH1. This is the severity adjusted length of stay measure. Here we're providing some more detail and clarity around the IBM Advantage Suite. So we've updated the exclusions to include patients with Medicaid enrollment. And then we've also had some extreme outliers below or above the IBM market scan average based on length of stay. So we've pulled those outliers out of the measure, as well as provided some minor revisions, including the risk adjustments and additional considerations. For PH1, this is the increase, the percentage of patients who had a well visit within a rolling 12-month period measure. We've had some minor updates in denominator and numerator wording, and then we've also updated the exclusions. So this is going to be consistent with what we've discussed before, but patients not continuously enrolled in Medicaid, patients with Medicare enrollment at any point, including dual eligible, patients with third-party insurance, patients with managed care, and patients with emergency Medicaid at any point. And then finally, for this measure, we added claim type codes into the additional considerations. BP2, pediatric bronchiolitis, appropriate use of bronchodilators. In this case, we've added observation setting to the numerator and denominator, and we've clarified the age, or clarified that the age is based on the date of admission. For CP3, pediatric sepsis for timely antibiotics. Here we've added observation setting to the numerator and denominator, and we clarified that the age is at the date of diagnosis, not the admission date. So SWBH3, using alternatives to opioids or the ALTA measure in hospital emergency departments. So this is going to be the measure with the biggest updates this round. Through many conversations, the department has come to recognize the difficulty that hospitals were having around the MME conversion tables. So these were completely removed from the measure. We will still be looking at decreased use of opioids and increased use of altos, but instead of it being MME per 1,000, we are looking at emergency department encounters with an administration of opioid is listed in the opioids of interest per 1,000 ED encounters for patients 18 years or older. So in terms of at-risk, 0% of the at-risk is related to decreasing opioid use, and 100% of the at-risk is related to increasing alto use. Although measure performance will be based on increasing alto use alone, data related to decreasing opioids is still required to be reported. So this is looking at your reporting score as well as your performance score, which will be applicable in future years starting in program year 3. 2 altos of interest have been added to the altos of interest list: ropivacaine and bupivacaine or Marcaine. Furthermore, it is important to note that the resulting rate for the alto measure should not exceed 1,000 in reporting. So whenever you're inputting that into your self-reported measure workbook, be sure to check the levels. The department, as well as CHA, will complete an informational webinar kind of detailing some of this and providing an ED alto specific office hours in the first couple weeks of January. So with these changes, it doesn't change what should have been built from each hospital. We will have these work groups and office hour sessions in the near future, to make sure all concerns are addressed and hospitals are ready for reporting. Everyone that has been reporting to CHA and the department about their ED alto data does not need to change what that looks like. They are just informing, or at least the updates are informing you on how the calculations are done internally. So please continue to submit that data. And then if there are necessary adjustments, they'll contact you directly. So if you've been filtering before sending the data, you will need to resend the data. So here during our training, we received several questions related to the alto measure. So I'm gonna call out a couple of those questions and explain the responses that were provided. So the first question is, Matt, can you speak further on the at-risk being tied to alto use? Does this change not promote hospitals to give ibuprofen to every ED patient? Will this quickly become a top-down measure? So to answer, Matt Haynes had responded, we had assurances that this is not something that doctors will agree to do, even if it is promoting the measure. There will not be at-risk tied to this. Next question. Has there been discussion about giving us more time to submit the alto data, since we'll have to rework our dashboard? In response, with these changes, that does not change what should have been built within hospitals. These work groups and sessions are to make sure hospitals are in a good place to submit by January, provide additional guidance and office hours. Regarding reporting, one participant asked, when filtering, how far back should we go? In which CHA replied, filter to October 1st, 2021 through September 30th, 2022. Another person asked, can we submit it as one file for an entire year with the new meds? And to that, yes, you can upload the entire baseline year in one file. And then hospitals have an option to send their ER census data, and CHA will filter. To note, for hospitals who have been sending data thus far, do not need to change your reporting process. You will be contacted directly if there are any questions or concerns. And if you have any questions or any additional thoughts, feel free to reach out to the folks from CHA, including SA Irdaw at essey.yirdaw@cha.com, or Krista Smith, Krista, Krista.smith@cha.com, with any additional questions. So the next document that was updated was the scoring framework, and we'll talk through some of those updates here. Just a reminder, the scoring framework is that main source of document that outlines the general framework to provide hospitals detailed benchmark information for each performance measure, as well as how some of that scoring will be provided during the performance years. So in this latest version of the document, the benchmark methodologies were updated to align with the most recent measure specification updates. We also added clarity to the document regarding total measure points for critical access hospitals and high performing hospital calculations. The quarterly reporting guide has also been updated. Just a reminder, in order to access this document, you can go onto the website, go under tools and resources, and you'll be able to see the HTP quarterly reporting guide. And it will provide an overview of your quarterly reporting process, including interim activity reporting, CH&E reporting, milestone reporting, as well as performance measure reporting. This also includes information about the SRP period that we use in order to provide the performance measure training today. So we have had some minor edits and clarifications to the interim activity and CH&E reporting sections, mostly to clean up some language. We've also added additional detail to the guide to include milestone and CH&E reporting chapters. Particularly, we added more robust sections related to milestone amendments and course corrections. Just as a reminder, milestone reporting is approaching in April, so the reporting guide will be available to you. That's completely fleshed out so that you all have the tools and the information at hand as a reference. There's also a new chapter of information in the guide that is specific to milestone amendments. And so that chapter will be discussing how to make a milestone amendment, how to do course corrections. And then finally, there is a new chapter on performance measure reporting. This chapter contains super important details related to the upcoming baseline data reporting, as well as performance measure reporting annually thereafter through the end of the program. In terms of the appendix, there has been additional information added there as well. We've added the milestone reporting survey prompts. So these are the Qualtrics survey prompts. So whenever hospitals are reporting milestones, these are the ones that you'll be seeing. The first milestone reporting period won't be until April, but again, we've added that appendix there so you can actually see what the survey will look like, as well as how you can start utilizing your quarterly reporting tool, that template, in order to prepare you for that reporting in April. Additional training and guidance will also be provided at a later date. So we do want to emphasize here that hospitals should thoroughly review all the new chapters, but specifically the new chapter on performance measure reporting ahead of this next reporting period. So reporting for program year 2, quarter 1 will include your standard interim activity reporting and CH&E reporting, as well as a new reporting section for performance measures. Any questions that the hospitals do have on performance measures will more than likely be answered in the guide, as well as covered in today's performance measure training. This will include how to access the information you need to successfully report, how to get a score of complete and on time, as well as some other policies around data availability. All right, so now let's discuss the baseline data availability policy. This was discussed previously in work group slides, but we definitely wanted to highlight it again because it is a critical component for performance measure reporting, especially coming onto the January reporting date. So this particular policy is really focused in on program year 1 and program year 2 for hospital calculated measures, so that hospitals can be prepared for their requirements for submission. Essentially, hospitals will have an option to self-report a numerator of no data available, or what we call NDA. So if hospitals are unable to report a numerator for data, or the data that you are able to report is incomplete or inaccurate, instead of, putting a blank, hospitals will indicate the status by entering NDA into the hospital self-reported measure workbook. Hospitals will be required to explain their data limitations on additional tabs, and then anytime no data available or NDA is indicated, you will be prompted to move to another tab and explain your data limitations. So this is only available for the numerator, and hospitals should report denominators for every measure. So in some cases, we're going to need hospitals to report and provide complete data for measures when it does become available. I think a key takeaway here is a NDA is an available option for certain measures. It's also only available for numerator reporting. So if a hospital has or would like to report NDA, and it's for specific measures related to RAE notifications, that will not impact the hospital's reporting score. If a hospital reports a blank when they meant to report an NDA, that will affect the hospital's completeness score. So I think we'll highlight this again. NDA entries may impact the hospital's reporting score. So there's two different classifications. If you submit an NDA entry in your numerator, you will receive a score of complete in Program Years 1 and Program Years 2 only for measures that have fixed benchmarks. So these are your RAE notification measures. We understand hospitals are still working towards certain interventions, and if you didn't have data in October 2021, or if you had any data between October 2021 and September 2022, but it was considered partial, here is the opportunity where you'll still be able to indicate NDA and receive a complete reporting score for these measures only. And again, this is only for Program Years 1 and 2. In Program Years 3, 4, and 5, NDA will not be acceptable for any measures, at least in terms of impacting your reporting score. The following measures are the ones that will be affected. So these are your RAE notification measures: RH1, RH3, SWCP1, CP2, CP3, CP4, CP5, CP6, SWBH1, SWBH2, BH1, BH2, COE1, COE4. So again, these are the measures where there are established fixed benchmarks, and then either we're using national data sets or we already know what the benchmarks needs to be for these measures. If you select NDA for measures without fixed benchmarks, no matter which program year, but particularly some of these measures, SW RH2, RH4, CP1 pediatric, CP7, SWBH3, so COE2, COE3, PH2, PH3, you must later report data available for those measures. So they are not measures that we identified as needing benchmarks, but are in hospital self-reported measure workbooks. So we expect data to be available from the hospital for these measures. If a hospital selects NDA for any of these measures or does not report data for their numerator, these will receive a score of incomplete. NDA is reported in the self-reported measure workbook, and claims-based measures are not in your self-reported measure workbook because they will be provided by the state. So during the question and answer portion, one participant did ask, what's the preferred way to report out our numerators for RAH1, SWBH1, and SWCP1, since these are all RAE notification requirements and UC Health hasn't shared their data yet. Do we say 0 or do we say NDA? And then we would like to confirm that if you would please report NDA for array notification measures if you don't have that information. I think a good distinction is NDA for applicable measures, an NDA for the numerator will result in a complete score. For other measures, an NDA for the numerator will result in an incomplete score. A blank in a numerator will indicate incomplete reporting for that measure. And then a 0 is to indicate the actual value. So it should be very unlikely, but if any measure has a value of 0, you would input the actual value, the number value. So please limit 0 to only if that was the actual case, if that was what you all saw in your data. So NDA entries may for measures without fixed to report NDA and not have complete data. We would still want the hospital to report the partial data instead of getting inaccurate data. So let's say it's a measure that says your achievement threshold is your program year 1 data. So if you don't hit a benchmark, you get to earn some of the at-risk for partial reporting. We do need the program year 1 data as it's critical to calculating the achievement thresholds, as well as helps set certain benchmarks. So hospitals are required to provide the data as it comes available. Benchmarks will be calculated as established in the scoring framework document if the data is received prior to annual benchmark calculations. If a complete data set is not received, that hospital's data will be excluded from those benchmark calculations where average performance is the calculation methodology. If the data is not received prior to annual benchmark calculation, the hospital may require an alternative benchmark for measures where the calculation methodology is based on individual performance. Again, the only instances where you would be required to submit data if you didn't have it are for those measures where we expect you to have data. If it's a fixed benchmark measure, we're not going to ask you to go back and report that data. So NDA entries may impact the hospital's achievement threshold calculations. This is something that we were aware of. So again, hospitals are required to report the data as it becomes available. Achievement thresholds will be calculated as established in the scoring framework document if the data is received prior to annual achievement threshold calculation. If that data is not received prior to the annual achievement threshold calculation, hospitals' data will be excluded from achievement threshold calculations, where average performance is a calculation methodology. If the data is not received prior to annual achievement threshold calculation, the hospital will not have an achievement threshold for measures where the achievement threshold is based on PY1 performance. So this is critical. It means that hospitals, if you did not submit that particular baseline data, hospitals will have to meet the established benchmark in order to earn associated at-risk dollars for applicable measures. There will not be an achievement threshold because it is based on your PY1 performance. For measures without achievement threshold set in PY1, if we receive an NDA in reporting, we will need that data by the time we calculate performance data in program year 3. All right, so this next slide, we will be reviewing the self-reported measure workbook in its entirety. I will turn it over to Alicia Jones to provide an overview of the workbook.
Thank you, Julia. We will start by walking through each section of the self-reported measure workbook to provide context and detail. And we'll follow up by pulling up the workbook and walking through it as well for an all-encompassing overview of the document to make sure all of you are very comfortable with the workbook before reporting. As a reminder, HTP measures are either calculated by the department using Medicaid claims data or are calculated and self-reported annually by the hospitals. The workbook is only utilized to report the self-reported measures. Hospitals will receive a customized workbook tailored to their selected measures to report performance results. And that document will follow a prescribed naming scheme. So you can see that below on the slide here. You'll see Chase ID - hospital name _ PY1 self-reported measures _ blank. So that's going to be present in your CPAS account, and it's already there for you to go ahead and view and get comfortable with. Once completed, hospitals will re-upload the final workbook to their CPAS account for department review. And later on in the slide deck, we're going to go into detail on exactly where to access that workbook and how to re-upload it once you've completed it. The self-reported measure workbook includes several tabs. That includes an introduction, an overview, data entry, data limitations, an attestations tab, and a measure information tab. So to provide an overview of the Overview tab, all measures that have been selected by the hospital are listed here. For each measure, it's identified whether that measure is calculated by the hospital or HCPF. All required hospital calculated measures will auto-populate on the Data Entry tab. So we have an example here for a test hospital showing the measures that they reported. So you can see in the reported measure column, it says yes for those measures. And then the calculation method indicates hospital calculated versus HCPF calculated. So this hospital will only be responsible for inputting data for those that say hospital calculated. And again, every hospital is going to get a customized workbook. So only the measures that your hospital has selected will be displayed. Moving on to the Data Entry tab, hospitals will utilize the Data Entry tab to submit measure data every year. And that reporting, again, will be pre-selected for the hospital. And those measures that they've selected are going to be the only ones that are visible on the Data Entry tab. The Data Entry tab includes pre-populated columns, which are a reported measure, yes or no, the measure ID, the measure name, measure stratification, and calculation type. Calculation type meaning percentage, rate, or count. Hospital input is only required in the hospital input columns, and those columns have a pale yellow fill color where entry is required by the hospital. And those input columns are only the numerator and denominator columns, with the exception of the pediatric readmission measures, which will also require input in the results column. Once data is entered, that fill color will change to green, and the type of calculation, whether that's percentage, rate, or count, impacts what data entry is required. So for instance, a count will not require both a numerator and a denominator, as it only requires a simple count. Hospitals must enter a numerical value greater than 0 in the denominator for hospital input sections. And the workbook will show an error message if a 0 is entered. And once we get to the walkthrough of the workbook, I'll show you an example of that. The result, benchmark conclusion, and data validation columns are automatically calculated based on the hospital input columns. For percentage measures, there is a certain type of input that's required. As a reminder, percentage measures measure the number of a certain set of events that are proportional to one another. The numerator and denominator are the same unit of measurement, and the numerator is a subset of the denominator. Measures with a percentage calculation type are going to require the hospital to enter both a numerator and a denominator. And as you can see in the screenshot below, that hovering over the input cell will provide details on the requirements for that particular measure and data reporting element. Data validation is built in to check for transposition errors in percentage measures. So you can see in the example that we've provided where NDA was entered, the data validation error indicates or prompts the hospital to complete the data limitations tab. Where the data appears to have been correctly entered, meaning no transposition errors, no NDA entries or 0 entries, your data validation message is going to say clear of data entry validation errors. As a reminder, rate measures are a specific kind of ratio in which two measurements are related to each other but do not utilize the same unit of measurement. The numerator is not a subset of the denominator when rate is calculated. A rate measures the number of events compared to another unit of measurement. Measures with rate calculation types will also require a numerator and denominator. And again, hovering over those input cells will provide details on the requirements for that particular measure and data reporting element. Again, data validation is built in to check for transposition errors. The message is just going to look a little bit different when the rate is out of 1,000. So it will say the result cannot exceed 1,000, check for transposition errors. As a callback to SWBH3, last year there was an error in that message that indicated the result could not exceed 1,000, and under the prior measure specifications that was incorrect. But now that the measure has been updated, your rates for the ED Alta measure should not exceed 1,000, so you will see that error message again, but this year it is correct. NDA or zero numerator entries will receive a data validation message to complete the data limitations tab, as you can see here. For count measures, this is just a simple sum of actions that qualify for inclusion. For HTP measures, this can be a count of patients, visits, or days, depending on the measure. Measures with a count calculation type require hospitals to enter only one data point, a simple count, and that is going to be in the numerator column. So you'll see an example below for COE3, where the numerator column has the possibility of a data entry, and the denominator column is grayed out and has not applicable in the cell. So that should be intuitive to the hospitals to know that I only need to report data in that numerator column. If you do accidentally report or put a number in the wrong column, where you put it in the denominator instead of the numerator, or both, you will get a data validation error indicating that the denominator field is not applicable to this measure and to remove. NDA or zero numerator entries will still receive a data validation message to complete the data limitations tab for count measures. Benchmarks. As I mentioned previously, there are columns for benchmark calculations in this workbook, and of course those will not be included. Well, they are included on the data entry tab, the columns themselves, but the actual benchmarks will not be included on the data entry tab until PY3. So until PY3, the benchmark conclusion columns will read NA for current year. In the future, the benchmark column will display what the benchmark is for that particular hospital and measure, and the benchmark conclusion column will calculate whether the hospital has met or not met that benchmark. No hospital data entry will be required to calculate benchmarks. The benchmarks will be calculated by the department based on the prior year measured data where applicable, or standard benchmarks set. Moving on to the data limitations tab. This is a brand new tab this year. It will auto-populate the measure ID, measure name, and reporting score impact based on the hospital input in the data entry tab. So the whole purpose of this tab is around that no data available or NDA policy that we've been speaking about, where the hospital either doesn't have data to report based on the measure specifications or doesn't have complete data to report. So rather than reporting erroneous data, we've asked hospitals to enter NDA and then essentially explain what those limitations are. So that's why the data limitations tab has been added. So here on this tab, if you've entered any NDAs or even zeros in the numerator on the data entry tab, those measures are going to auto-populate for you. And then hospitals are responsible for providing a descriptive overview of the data limitation, cause of the limitation, and the planned mitigation strategy. And we've included some examples of what you might input here as well for reference. The reporting score impact is based on the baseline data availability policy that we previously reviewed. So just to recap, in PY1, the reporting score impact will turn green or red depending on whether the NDA entry was for a measure with a fixed benchmark or complete, or for a measure without a fixed benchmark, which would have a negative reporting score impact of incomplete. The workbook will not be accepted as complete if there are measures with NDA or 0 numerator entries and the data limitations tab is not complete. Going back to the reporting score impact, we just want to emphasize that this reporting score impact is solely based on the impact of reporting an NDA. Just because you see complete here does not mean that your reporting score for performance measures will be deemed complete. There are several other factors that go into it. So not only do all of the selected measures that are hospital self-reported need to have data reported that is, complete and without NDA entries unless the additional descriptions are filled out, but there also needs to be completed and sufficient responses to your interim and CH&E activity survey, as that all rolls up to a single reporting score for PY2 Q1. So I just wanted to make that very clear that this is not indicating that your submission will be deemed complete, but rather determining what the impact of that NDA entry is for this particular measure. Moving on to the attestation tab, hospitals must conduct internal quality control reviews of the data input before submission. And basically the attestation tab is just attesting that that internal quality control review has been conducted. Hospitals will be asked to read and review those attestation statements. The attestation statements have not changed from last year. So again, it's basically just certifying that you've reviewed the information, it's true and accurate and complete to the best of your knowledge. You're also, submitting a claim for state and federal funds by submitting this information. You're also agreeing or certifying that you understand that HCPF reserves the right to perform audits of this information, and that data to support what you've input on the data entry tab should be kept or maintained for at least 6 years. So you will be required to check that box stating agree. In prior years, that for the PY0 dress rehearsal, that was optional, but going forward, starting with PY1, that box does have to be checked for your workbook to be deemed complete. If this box is not checked, your submission is not complete. Measure information tab. So this is just a resource for hospitals. It includes reference information about all program performance measures, both hospital self-reported and claims-based measures, in one place, in an Excel format rather than how the measure specifications are formatted in Word, to allow for filtering on various criteria. This information aligns with the current HTP measure specifications document, but should not be used in place of the measure specifications document because it doesn't include as much detail. Measure specifications should be used as your source of truth. It has all of the detail where what's included on this tab is a more concise version. The measure specifications will provide more detail regarding inclusions, exclusions, and other important parameters. So we've provided a link here on the slide for the full and updated measure specifications. Okay, before we move on to this next section, I'm going to pull up the workbook and we will do a detailed review of the hospital measure selection workbook. Okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. All right, so the first tab is an introduction tab, just walking through what the purpose of this workbook is, an overview of all of the tabs that are included and what their purpose is, as well as some more detailed instructions on how to utilize each tab. The overview tab, as specified previously, includes all of the hospital's measures that they have selected, as indicated in this yes/no column here. So if I were to change the Chase ID or to a different hospital, then different measures would be indicated as selected. And when you open up your specific hospital's workbook, you will only see the measures that your hospital selected. It will be filtered down. For all hospitals that have a yes in this reported measure column and hospital calculated in the calculation method column, those will populate on the data entry tab. So you can see here, we've got the reporting period automatically selected. This workbook is for PY1, which is October 2021 to September of 2022. This time period is to be utilized as the baseline for setting performance benchmarks starting in PY3. Each measure has a header that's in this blue color, and then the body here. And this is helpful specifically for measures that have multiple parts. As you can see here with statewide CP1, you've got your header for the measure in its entirety, and then you've got each component where you've got your rolled up numerator and denominator for social needs screening and notification, and then each type of those screens for total positive, housing instability, food insecurity, transportation problem, utility help needs, and interpersonal safety. You can see here that your input columns have that pale yellow fill color that we discussed. So this is where you would enter in your numerator and your denominator. Results typically are automatically calculated based on that input, the only exception being your pediatric readmission measures, which will require hospitals to enter a risk-adjusted rate from PHIS. Okay, so I will show you a couple of entries. So if I enter NDA, then you can see the green fill color is indicating that input is being accepted in terms of it's a valid input. Of course, a rate cannot be calculated because we don't have a numerator. So your rate is going to show up as inconclusive. And then your data validation prompt will say, please complete the data limitations tab. And then if I go to the data limitations tab, that measure will automatically populate here for me. So we'll come back to that. I want to emphasize that it's really important to utilize this naming convention. If you enter it like in period D, period A, period, that is not going to be recognized by the workbook, and that will not auto-populate here. And as a reminder, if you enter NDA in any kind of way on your data entry tab, you have to fill out the data limitations tab. So if this doesn't flow through, then the hospital is at risk for missing that measure and not putting it on their limitations tab, and therefore your reporting score may be impacted by that. So make sure you enter it as NDA in that exact format. Additionally, you have to enter in a denominator for your workbook submission to be deemed complete. You can't just leave it as NDA and then leave this blank. Otherwise, that will be incomplete. Let's also show an example of a transposition error. Okay, so here you can see I've entered in my numerator and denominator backwards by accident. My validation error indicates the results cannot exceed 100%. Check for transposition errors. There are also validation in here that prevents me from entering in a denominator of a 0. Your denominator should be greater than 0. So if I try and enter 0, I'm going to get this error message that pops up that says denominator must be a numerical value greater than 0, and hit retry, and it will not allow me to put that 0 there. Another thing to emphasize here is that even if you do input data that appears correct, and you get this clear of data entry validation errors message, that does not mean that the state will not potentially find other red flags for potential inaccuracies once all workbooks have been submitted. So we're going to get to this here in a little bit, but once all workbooks are submitted, the state and Myers and Stauffer will review all submissions and review them against one another, which will allow us to have a better gauge for potential inaccuracies or incomplete data submissions. And we may have additional flags or data validation error messages throughout that process that will go back to the hospital. So just because you see a clear of data validation or data entry validation errors here This is a very minimal check. We will be doing a deeper dive, and you may receive additional notices after all workbooks have been received of potential flags. All right, so you can see I entered NDA for 2 measures here. So let's move on to the data limitations tab. On the data limitations tab, here are my 2 measures that I utilized that input for. And so both of these measures have fixed benchmarks. So what that means is entering NDA is not going to impact my reporting score for the current year. So that's why it says my reporting score impact is complete. But you do still have to enter the data limitation description, cause of data limitation, and mitigation strategy. Otherwise, your submission is not complete, regardless of what this says. Okay, moving on to the attestation tab. As I mentioned, workbooks will not be accepted as complete unless this box is checked. So before submitting your workbook, make sure you have checked that box and you can see the little check mark there. You're also asked to enter the submission date, submitted by, contact phone number, and contact email address here. And then we have the Measure Information All tab. I know that's pretty small, but it basically gives you an overview of the measure specifications. And like I said, you can filter on particular measures. You can filter on specific criteria. It may be a little bit easier to navigate in some regards as opposed to the measure specifications document. So you've got definition, who's the measure steward, data source, numerator, denominator definitions, target population, stratifications and risk adjustments. You've got your benchmark information, which has been updated to align with the current measure specifications. And then you've also got, this is a new column added this year, benchmark methodology. So if you wanted to see what measures have a fixed benchmark to kind of gauge the impact of that NDA policy, you could filter here on your ones that say fixed. And these are all of the measures that would still be deemed complete, whether a NDA entry was entered or complete data. All right, and that takes us through the entire workbook. So now we will go back to specific instructions on how to download and submit that workbook. So this slide contains just an overarching overview of the steps for accessing the workbook, and then the following slides provide a step-by-step screenshot for each of these steps. So to access your workbooks, you're going to want to navigate to CPAS and log in, navigate to your hospital's document repository, navigate to the performance measure submission folder, then the PY1 21 to 22 folder, then download the Excel file labeled with your hospital name and Chase ID. So as you can see here, there's a screenshot showing you where to log in on the CPAS page. Here is where your document repository is located on that ribbon. Then here is your performance measure submission folder and your PY1 21 to 22 folder. And then here's where you will see your blank workbook available for download. So again, you'll notice that this has blank in the name and it has PY1 in the name. So to download it, you're going to check the box, and then in the Actions section, you'll click on the drop-down, select Download Selected Items, and then click Process. So at that point, you've downloaded your workbook and you can start working on it. Once the workbook is complete and accuracy is verified, hospitals will upload the completed workbook to CPAS in the same location where the blank copy was originally accessed. And you'll also want to notify the CO HTP at MSLC box. We do have a mechanism that will automatically notify us, but as I'll go over here in just a second, it's not foolproof. So it's always good to shoot us an email just to confirm that that has been submitted. When uploading a completed copy, change the file name from blank to complete. So here's an example. You'll want to use this exact naming scheme. It's the exact same naming scheme as what your blank workbook was. You just changed the very tail end of that naming scheme from _blank to _complete. And the reason we, want to really emphasize this naming scheme is because we have a mechanism that will notify us automatically if a workbook is uploaded under this naming scheme. But if this naming scheme is not followed, it doesn't always notify us. Now, I want to also put your minds at ease that there's not a risk that we will miss your submission, regardless of whether our automated function doesn't work and regardless of whether you forget to email us. We will be going in, on or after the deadline, checking every single folder for submissions that we haven't received yet to make sure that that we haven't missed something. So we will be checking manually before we indicate that a workbook was not submitted timely. It just helps us if the naming scheme is followed and that follow-up email is submitted. Please note that hospitals should not move, add, delete rows or columns in the workbook, and the workbook should be submitted in Excel format. So you shouldn't be able to move, add, or delete rows because the workbook is locked, but just to emphasize that. And you also don't want to, say, print it to PDF and then submit it. We want it definitely submitted in Excel. The department will review all data submissions, and then upon completion of that review, the data will be uploaded to our data warehouse for use in future program dashboards, benchmark setting, and/or achievement calculation. Okay, so here is your step-by-step to upload the completed workbook. So again, we're in CPAS. We have navigated to our document repository. We've clicked on the performance measure submission folder and the PY1 21 to 22 folder. So we're in the exact same folder where we were previously, where we got the blank workbook. And all we're going to do is select this file upload section. You'll want to click on this little arrow here to expand your file upload section. When that's expanded, you can see now the arrow is pointing downward. And in the upload file, you want to choose your file. And then once your file is named here, you'll hit upload. And you can see here, just as comparison, the blank workbook that we provided versus the completed workbook from the hospital side by side. And that concludes our overview of the hospital self-reported measure workbook, how to access it, and how to submit it. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Julia. Thank you.
Next, we will be discussing the minimum submission review for performance measures. So once reporting has ended and measure workbooks are submitted, the team will complete the process of collecting all the data from the workbooks and aggregate this data into one place. So this allows us to complete additional data validation testing and take steps to compare the same measures from different hospitals or against one another. The minimum submission review will mainly be a check for potential flags for incomplete submissions or potential inaccurate data. And going forward, this will allow us to compare data year over year to also identify potential inaccuracies in the data that was submitted and further enhance our minimum submission review process. So the minimum submission review process is going to be a little bit of an enhancement, a little bit different from the data validation errors that are currently present or currently can be shown in hospital self-reported measure workbooks. Those that are in the self-reported measure workbooks tend to be very minimal. But in the MSR process, the Myers and software team will be conducting a more in-depth analysis. So if the reported data is flagged as incomplete or inaccurate, this information will be captured in the initial determination letters that are sent out to hospitals, and the hospital will receive an initial determination score of incomplete, which will prompt hospitals to submit an SRP form to potentially adjudicate any of those questions or any of those concerns. So in this case, the SRP process can be utilized to either confirm the accuracy of what was submitted, and then it may also involve revising the initial submission or or allow hospitals to submit additional documentation and explanation. So the minimum submission review Again, all of those results are kind of captured within the initial determination letters the hospitals will receive after the department review of all PY2 quarter one submissions. So this includes both your interim activity reporting, CH&E reporting within the survey, as well as your hospital self-reported measure information that is included in the hospital self-reported measure workbook. So we'll include all of the determination scores as well as any MSR findings in that initial letter. Hospitals, again, through the SRP process, will be able to review any data flags that were discussed or brought forth during that initial review, and then they can use the SRP process to correct any of these data submissions or answer any of the questions by confirming the accuracy of what was previously submitted. So claims-based measures, we're going to provide a quick overview of the SFTP process. So claims-based measures are not reported via the self-reported measure workbook, as they are calculated by the state and then transferred to hospitals via the SFTP, Secure File Transfer Protocol. This is the system utilized last year for hospitals, if you remember, during the dress rehearsal, PY0 dress rehearsal submission. For PY1, we will be using a very similar process. So the PY1 claims-based measure files will be uploaded and available in your SFTP accounts by the end of February. So February 28th, 2023. We've also included a link to the SFTP website on this slide for your convenience. But generally speaking, as a reminder, each hospital will have at least two contacts registered to their name, which are associated to your primary and secondary contacts. Those contacts can be found on your CPAS page. So whenever you review your reporting dashboard, there is a program participation dashboard that includes, your contact information. So the primary and secondary contacts will be utilized for the SFTP process. The username that is associated with your SFTP is also included on this slide. It looks like GA5105 and then the organization, so your hospital name, as well as the first initial and last name of the contact. So this is a pretty critical component. We will be reviewing this information again during the January work group, as well as during January office hours and the February work group. These slides are more of an introduction. And then generally around claims-based measures, there is currently a timeline set for the process of transmitting claims-based data to hospitals in February 2023, as well as providing additional information related to benchmarks. So the benchmarks that are set based off of that first year results, those will be released in May of 2023. So the team has additional work to complete. So the information is not currently scheduled to be released earlier to hospitals related to benchmarks. All right, SRRP for performance measures. So SRRP, scoring review and reconsideration period. The SRRP for performance measures is slightly different than the previous quarters that we've experienced so far. So PY1Q3, PY1Q4 of reporting, that is where hospitals were primarily focused on standard interim activity and CH&E reporting. However, in PY2 quarter one reporting, hospitals will still have applicable sections for interim activity and CH&E reporting, but hospitals will also submit additional information related to their performance measures. Once they receive their initial determination letters and their scores, they'll also be able to review information related to those performance measures. So any completeness scoring, as well as any information related to the MSR findings, can be found in those initial determination letters. If a hospital does receive an incomplete or request for additional information, this is when hospitals can enter into SRP. So hospitals can submit through SRP any additional documentation during the performance measure portion, because we do want to ensure accurate and complete data for benchmarking purposes. And so this is an opportunity to make sure we're getting the data correct. And it will be important and reflective of your performance overall in the program. So we want to be sure we're accurately monitoring the performance, your performance within the program. So the main difference is that previously SRP was limited to only, issues of scoring, but for performance measures, there is an opportunity for hospitals to submit additional documentation or make revisions based off of the comments that were submitted through the SRP period. So SRP for performance measures. The SRP form is going to be consistent, and there is a portion within that you can indicate whether or not you would like to request SRP for performance measures. So all quarters of reporting, you can use the same form. This template can be found in the CPAS document repository. Hospitals will then select this particular performance measure component from the reconsideration requested list to indicate that you have necessary updates that need to be made. So then we'll move on to table 5. We took a screenshot and put it on the slide, but this is also within the same form. So this is where hospitals will include the reconsideration request information, and you will need to fill it out in order to submit the SRP request. So after minimum submission review and review of the completeness of data reporting, hospitals will receive that initial determination letter detailing the results of the first review. If you disagree with the initial scoring, or if you need to address any incomplete or inaccurate data information, you do so through this process. If the department flags something as incomplete because of the validation tests, the MSR that was conducted, and it raises some flags, but what the hospital had submitted was in fact correct and complete, this is your opportunity to also indicate that your reporting was accurate and that you confirm your submission. So the SRP process for performance measures specifically can be utilized to either confirm the accuracy of what was submitted, or it might also involve revising your initial submission or submitting additional documentation or explanation. If you do submit SRP, this is just a note, for performance measures for PY2Q1, you are also eligible to submit information related to interim activity reporting, CH&E reporting. It's not like a you can only select one of these. It's all that apply based off the quarter of reporting. So in program year 2, quarter 1 reporting, the initial reporting will be based on those 3 components. Performance measure timeline. So we'll take a look at our timeline for performance measures moving forward. This process overall does repeat each year, and the performance measure reporting will occur in January, followed by the SRP that is through parts of February, and then we'll be finalizing all quarterly scores and then benchmark setting. So, program year 1 is going to be that first critical year. Once benchmarks are set, that will no longer be applicable, but we will, instead of that, be uploading all of your relevant measure information to your dashboards. You'll be able to see that information, and then also there will be a period of calculation of your performance. So, reporting for hospitals, there is a review period by the department and Myers and Stauffer. There's an SRP period where hospitals will be able to indicate areas where they may disagree or would like to provide additional information related to the initial determination letters. And then finally, a calculation period once all those results have been finalized to calculate performance or set benchmarks. So take a look at some upcoming dates in more detail. These are dates that we've set for program year 1 specifically, but for future program years, it will follow a very similar cadence. So hospitals are set to complete their self-reported measure workbook in the month of January. So by the end, January 31st, 2023 is the upcoming due date. Myers and Stauffer in the department will conduct initial reviews throughout the month of February. We'll be reviewing for timeliness and completion for your reporting. There is no performance measure achievement in program year 1. The department also during this time will be reviewing and compiling claims files during the month of February. So the information from the claims files will be released to hospitals by the end of February through the SFTP process. SRP requests for the upcoming quarter are then due early March 1st through March 14th. After, the SRP period, hospitals are able, to submit their SRP request. There will be final determinations that are set by the Myers and Stauffer team and the department, and those will be issued. And hospitals will receive that final notification or that notification of final scores by April 4th, 2023. These include also a posting of the measure, numerator, denominator, as well as results into the CPAS dashboard, and we will begin the calculation of benchmarks, or we'll have released the calculation of benchmarks. Excuse me, no. Calculation of benchmarks will be made and released in May 16, 2023. The initial PY1 measure data will be released to performance dashboards at the end of February, and then finalized again on April 4th. So if there was any updates to those performance measure information, that will then be reflected in the final results on April 4th. These general timelines are also laid out in the quarterly reporting guide. So now we will briefly discuss some baseline setting and benchmarks, kind of the expectations around what that look like. Again, benchmarks will be released as per the previous slide on May 16, 2023. So all performance measure data is going to be captured in the data warehouse. So this includes aggregating both all the hospital self-reported measure workbooks and then the claims-based measure information that will be provided by the department. For benchmarks, we will be looking at fine-tuning our calculations with the data that we are receiving just to get hospitals ready for that program year 3. But also we'll be, calculating those aggregate benchmarks, including the top 75%. We're going to be looking at baseline setting as well as any other benchmarks. In the future, just as a reminder, high-performing hospitals, so even past benchmarks, if a hospital is determined to be a high-performing hospital, aka those in the top 10%, they will be able to receive an upside risk. So this will be a redistribution of unearned at-risk dollars that are pooled together for each measure type and then redistributed to high performers. So that's something we'll get to see in future performance years, starting in program year 3. It's a little bit different with our reporting pieces, where if unearned at-risk dollars happen with general reporting, we redistribute those to all hospitals that did meet the requirement for reporting timely and complete, reporting. However, with performance measure achievement, again, starting in program year 3, the redistribution happens in the top 10% only. So some next steps for the program. We will review updated measure specifications. Well, we expect the hospitals to be looking through any of those final documents, including the measure specifications, the scoring framework, the quarterly reporting guide, as they're now currently posted on the site. The hospitals are now able to access CPAS and be able to access their self-reported measure workbook. So please look into it, get familiar with it, see how it is used. Review each of the components in each of the tabs of the workbook. And so you understand how the data needs to be entered as well as the formats that we're looking for. Also, this is where you would maybe want a refresher on the NDA / fixed benchmark policy, whether or not you can report NDAs for given measures or where you should have complete information. Hospitals still have to report on interactivity and CH&E in program year 2, quarter 1. So don't forget that there's still a Qualtrics survey that will be uploaded to your CPAS. Hospitals starting January 3rd will be able to access those. We'll send out a notification. But this is in addition to submission of your self-reported measure workbook. Both of these, so the self-reported measure workbook and the Qualtrics survey, do not need to be submitted at the exact same time, but both of them do need to be submitted by the January 31st deadline. So we will be reviewing that throughout the month of January. The baseline period that you all will be reporting in January. So you'll report in January, but the baseline period is for October 1st, 2021 through September 30th, 2022. Again, you'll get a heads up email ahead of reporting to let you know that that's coming. Then again, submit by January 31st. Hospitals in submission of their survey will receive a confirmation email once that survey is submitted, as well as a copy of their responses. And just to emphasize, I know we've gone over a lot of information in this training. A lot of this is laid out in the quarterly reporting guide. So if you need to review any information related to performance measures or a refresher on interim activity reporting, that's included. Because the self-reported measure workbooks are available in advance, it would be a good idea for hospitals to start downloading that information, getting comfortable with it, and reaching out ahead of time to see if you have any questions or need technical assistance so that we can make sure we have plenty of time to work through that. There will be office hours that are available the first 3 weeks of January, in addition to a hospital work group in January to help support hospitals through this new reporting component. So thank you again, everyone, for listening to this performance measure training for program year 1. If you have additional questions, please feel free to email cohtp@state.co.us. And then for any technical assistance questions, you may contact cohtp@mslc.com. Thank you again.